privileged in that we had actual grassroots level activists with experience. We had the private sector representative, and people with experience in other continents. But we concentrated on the practicalities, and we concentrated on the sort of situation that we've had in Europe. So we've by and large not discussed in detail the cluster system, except to note that when it is in place, it's important to ensure that grassroots organisations are aware of when and where the clusters are meeting, that they are welcome. We talked briefly about the use of social media in those sort of situations in promulgating where the cluster system is meeting. In other cases, and particularly what's been happening in Europe, it's been a system of on-the-spot collaboration, and very much driven in the first instance in Calais by only grassroots organisations. So we had some very good examples. The most important thing we felt was that the NGOs needed better to communicate their needs so that grassroots organisations could respond, and in return that grassroots organisations need to communicate the situation to NGOs and to inform them where there are needs or things missing. At the moment there seems to be a lack of communication in both ways. The other thing that came up from people with experience of working in Europe at the grassroots end was that the NGOs were very slow to respond, the formal NGOs. I don't know what one can do about that, that's more of the global level. But the point that was made that we felt very strongly about is that the people who did then arrive didn't seem to have a grip on what they were doing. And not to denigrate the work that's being done on Lesbos and Calais and everywhere else, the NGOs have got people who have been used to dealing with millions of refugees in really appalling remote areas. And the feeling was that NGOs are sending young and inexperienced people to the European theatres, and perhaps they should be bringing some people back from CAR, South Sudan, Yemen, and putting them in to these emergencies in Europe. It seemed to be the case that whether they're short of staff or just it's a nice easy number to break in people who haven't got a lot of experience. Better relationships with the government. In a lot of cases where there's been a problem of the NGOs and the UN agencies going in, various emergencies in the world has been because of the reluctance of the governments to let them in. I speak with some feeling, having been working in Myanmar as the only agency that was allowed into Rakhine for the first two months. We felt particularly that NGOs who had offices in different countries should make a big effort to have better relationships with the government, so if anything did crop up, then they would be better able to go in and intervene. In terms of coordination, communication, doing joint needs assessments, one of the things that happens a lot when people first arrive in a new emergency is to rush in and help without really studying in detail the needs, and that can waste a lot of time and effort. So if the NGOs can work with the grassroots organisations, the NGOs who have probably got a lot of experience in doing needs assessments, with government, obviously working also with the beneficiaries, to establish a joint needs assessment, which in turn would lead to some kind of division of labour between the different agencies. And taking up a point that was made this morning about coordinated training, wondering whether one could, say, designate every third Sunday morning to a training day or half day, maybe on a different sector, so 1 month, even bringing in experts from other places to come and train the different NGOs, grassroots agencies, anybody who wants to come, for not just formal training but information sharing as well. And the final point was on the use of the private sector, involve the private sector, and we talked a little bit about not just how you could use the private sector in their formal commercial sense, but looking at possibilities for getting involved with some of the companies that have got their own foundations or trusts, drawing on their corporate social responsibility departments to try and get some free or discounted assistance in the practical movement of things and advice, as well as using their experience. So thank you to the group. Could you put your hands up, the group? There we are, splendid bunch of people. Keep up the good work. Thank you.
Thank you.